Hey everyone, Coach Tickety here. Blizzard just announced the latest Overwatch 2 map will be a King of the Hill or control map by the name of Antarctic Peninsula. This is the first new control map we've seen in a long time, the last one being Busan, released all the way back in August of 2018. The new map is set to feature new environmental effects with deep snow on the ground, cute little penguins scattered around, and even the ability to participate in a fishing minigame. In any case, the map is set to release with Season 3, which is only a few days away now, and while we can't take a look at the map just yet to break down some of its different features, we can definitely start to think about how to give ourselves a competitive edge when playing on it. So today we're going to be breaking down some tips for playing on King of the Hill as a map type. And if you're looking to learn more about map types or hero choices or matchups or playstyles or really anything about the game, you should check out the GameLeap website. You'll find hundreds of guides made by top-level coaches that are designed to help you improve your game, and these go more in depth than the average video on YouTube. And these aren't just for Overwatch either. There are tons of guides available for all the popular games out there on GameLeap, so do yourself a favor and get your membership started today by clicking this link. Kicking things off, my first tip here is to plan your rollout. First fights are incredibly important for King of the Hill, often setting the tone for the entire round. So while it is fun to kick around that basketball in the spawn room, you should also be thinking about how you want to take that fight. Try to visualize what positions around the map will give you an early advantage and get there as quickly as possible. Start moving as soon as those doors open. These first fights on King of the Hill are some of the only examples of a truly neutral engagement from either side, since both teams will be rolling out and neither has an early advantage in terms of positions. So try to close that distance first and maybe catch your enemies sleeping. And since that early momentum is so important, my next tip here is to speed up your rollout for not just yourself, but for your teammates. There are heroes on every single role that offer some level of mobility to help your team get out of spawn quickly. There's obviously Lucio with his speed and amp it up, there's Symmetra with her teleporter, and there's even Junker Queen now with her commanding shout that gives that extra move speed. You definitely don't need to lock these heroes for the entire round, but if you're looking for a fast advantage, you can use them to get out of spawn and then swap back to a hero with mobility to catch up with your team. For example, if you're planning on playing a tank such as Winston or Diva, it won't hurt your personal rollout at all to start off as Junker Queen, shout your teammates out the door, and then just swap back and use your mobility to catch up. And the same can be said for swapping off Symmetra after a teleport to a character like Tracer or Genji, who have no problem catching up, or even a support like Mercy or Kiriko after using that amp it up. Moving on, my next tip is to not go to the objective too early in a fight. Almost every single koth point has advantageous ground outside of where the objective lies that should be taken first rather than running to the point itself. While there are a few exceptions to this rule, such as, say, Nepal's Shrine, which has strong sightlines and lots of natural cover on the point itself, most koth points follow this rule and you shouldn't take it for granted. Make sure you're always thinking about potential high grounds, long sightlines, or flank routes you can be abusing that lie outside of the point and use those to disrupt enemy team members, maybe even forcing them onto the point early so that you can get a surround on them. This is especially relevant to backline members like DPS and support playing longer ranges, since they rarely want to find themselves face to face with an enemy tank on the objective. And don't forget that even if you don't plan on using that space yourself, it's still very important to try and control it and deny it from the enemy. Let's say you're playing a DPS like Tracer, and while you're not going to use that high ground, it's also important that you can stop the enemy soldier or Ashe or Hanzo from using it themselves, so we want to prioritize forcing them out first. Moving on to my next tip, which is don't kite, rotate. Some of the most defining characteristics of a koth point are that the maps are symmetrical, they're the same on both sides, and the objective doesn't move. This means that as you move into the enemy's side of the map, the only thing that's really changing is how close the spawn rooms are. And unless the fight's lasting about 5 minutes and people are constantly coming back from spawn, this shouldn't be something you're prioritizing when choosing a strong position. And since the point itself isn't going anywhere, you don't want to stray too far from it, since your pressure will feel much less relevant if you're too far away from the objective. So the next time you're feeling pressured out of a position, don't back up towards your spawn room, try moving around the objective. Let's use Ilios Well as an example here. If you're playing safe towards your side of the point near that choke point where everyone plays, then instead of backing up towards your spawn when you get pushed, try wrapping around towards the opposite side of the map as where the enemies are pushing. You'll find more free space and still keep that distance away from any aggressors. And during all that time, you'll still maintain roughly the same distance to the objective, meaning all your pressure will still be relevant during the ongoing teamfight. There are of course some maps that show this example more clearly than others. The space that you're trading might be more obvious, but I would say every koth point in the game offers some capability to trade space effectively that usually involves some kind of rotation. Alright, and my next tip is that you want to hold close after you've won a fight. And just for the purposes of this advice, let's just assume that we've won a clean fight. We've got all our members still alive. You want to leverage objective pressure, the fact that you have the objective under your control, over the enemy team as much as possible. Basically what this means is you want to make it as hard as possible for them to retake and flip it back into their favor. Holding close allows you to do this in two ways, wasting their time and forcing their resources. You'll waste their time by starting the fight off of the objective, meaning even if they manage to push you back, they still have to take time closing the distance and capping the point after the fact. And if you abuse strong positioning by using choke points and high grounds whenever possible, you'll likely force them to use resources just to get into that space that again isn't anywhere near the objective. You might even force them to use ultimates just to break into that space. And if you're not confident you can win the fight there and then, you can always just back up to the point. Now they've got one less ultimate going into the fight on the objective where it actually counts. But if the enemy team does start getting a lead on you and they are looking to close out a fight, my next tip is to die on point. Like I mentioned, objective progress is very important on King of the Hill. When you've got the lead, you want to maintain it and extend it as far as possible. Make sure you don't stray too far from the point while you're fighting or maybe taking duels, since if the enemy manages to flip the point as you're fighting, all of a sudden that team fight won't mean as much. This will be fine if you manage to win out the team fight and recap the point for yourselves, but in a losing fight, you want to make sure this never happens. Try to take note of when the fight is moving from ongoing into unwinnable territory. A good rule of thumb is when the enemy is up 2 or more kills. When this happens, you can move your priorities from trying to win the team fight or trying to get kills to trying to stall the objective. You can even coordinate touches on the point with your teammates to try and stall it as long as possible, frustrating the enemy and maybe even forcing bonus resources or ultimates out of them. But after the enemy cleans us up and finally flips the point into their favor, it's now on us to retake the point. So moving on to my next tip, which is to split on your retakes. Many players will default to grouping up and trying to push through a choke point together on their retakes, and this is fine as long as you have a strong frontline advantage. Imagine you're playing a tank like Orisa into a Winston, for example, you can easily force them out. But if you're having troubles and the enemy is following my advice and holding close and applying a lot of early pressure, you might be able to relieve some of that pressure by splitting up your positions on your retake. Let's use a koth point like Busan Mecha Base as an example. Everyone knows that after you cap the point and you win a fight, you go hold the high ground choke point because it's incredibly hard to break through that as a retaker. So if you don't have the front line suited to that take, or you don't have enough ultimates to dump into the choke to break it, you can try splitting up your angle. Try having some of your teammates act as bait, locking in all those defenders into their positions because that's where they think you're going to push. This will allow other high priority members to bypass all that defensive pressure and get open angles on the other choke points. This is usually most effective with long range DPS members who can then safely apply pressure to all those defenders on the high ground, and then that pressure should force them to back up, allowing the rest of your team to cross that choke point no problem. Keep in mind, all of this planning is just to get you through a choke point. This isn't going to win you a fight, this is just going to even the playing field so that you can fight properly. But of course, all the positioning in the world might not be enough to break those defenders. You might even need to make some hero swaps. So my tip here is if you're going to swap, swap after first fight. Assuming you've lost the first fight and noticed some problem members on the enemy team, maybe you need to pick a hit scan character to counter that Pharah, or maybe you need Kiriko Suzu to cleanse all these anti-healing effects coming through. Whatever the case, if you do this after first fight, you'll maintain as much of your ultimate economy as possible. And while that small percentage of ult charge might not seem like much right now, I promise you that ultimate economy is a very important aspect of the game, and even more so on King of the Hill maps. Because fights on Koth are generally so back and forth, and because the rounds themselves are relatively short, every ult matters. So if you think you're going to need to swap, make that decision early so that you don't fall behind in ultimate economy as the round goes on. And speaking of ultimates, my next tip is to use any objective lead you might have to stack up your ultimates. Now you won't always find yourself with a 99-0 lead on a Koth point, but anytime you've got your objective progress to around 85% or higher, you can tell yourself that you only really need to win one more clean fight to close out the round. And the easiest way to win a clean fight is with big ultimates and combos. When you're in this type of position, keep in mind that you don't need to fight tooth and nail for every single team fight. You don't need to scrap together all these losing situations and try and come out ahead regardless. You can instead wait for your opportune moment and find that perfect engage. You might even find yourself going for what coaches call a dry fight. A dry fight just means that your team is planning to go into the engagement without using any ultimates to get themselves ahead. The goal of which isn't always to win the team fight, although if you can, good on you, but instead to force the enemy to use ultimates, in which case we can stack up an ultimate lead in our favor and win the next team fight or the one after that. And moving on to our final tip, which is to make adjustments between rounds. On top of adapting to hero choices, compositions, playstyles, positions, and everything that makes a game of Overwatch, keep in mind that the maps change drastically between rounds on King of the Hill. This means that heroes that performed well in the first round might start to struggle just because of the changes in map geometry. You don't always need to swap out your hero entirely, but you should be adjusting your playstyle to adapt to new sight lines, high grounds, flank routes, and objective layouts. And of course, this is your best chance to take a breath and adjust to enemy players on the opposite team. If there are any standout players that are popping off that might need countering, or any weak players that you can try and take advantage of for free kills, this is your chance to capitalize on that. Whatever map you find yourself on, King of the Hill lends itself to some of the most chaotic and, in my opinion, most fun fights in the game. I hope the tips in this video help you make sense of some of that chaos and maybe even give you an edge in your next Koth game. And if you're looking to learn more about map types, or hero choices, or matchups, or playstyles, or really anything about the game, you should check out the GameLeap website. You'll find hundreds of guides made by top-level coaches that are designed to help you improve your game, and these go more in depth than the average video on YouTube. And these aren't just for Overwatch either. There are tons of guides available for all the popular games out there on GameLeap, so do yourself a favor and get your membership started today by clicking this link.